This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Ghost Panzer. Ghost Panzer is a squad-level tactical war game by Jim Krohn, published by Worthington games. This is the second entry in the Band of Brothers series. However, these rules can also be used with the first game in the series, which is called Screaming Eagles, and potentially the third game, which is coming out any day now, Texas Arrows. Worthington Games is releasing the first two games in this series as deluxe editions with nicer components, and releasing the third game, Texas Arrows, all at the same time in late summer of 2016. Now let's see some of the tactical history that inspired the design for the Band of Brothers series and Ghost Panzer. When gamers talk about squad-level tactical combat, it's important to understand what a squad actually is. The squad, whether it be American, British, German, or Russian, is the basic building block of military fighting structures. Typically, the squad is composed of 10 to 12 men. The squad is broken up into three subsections, as in this example. The security at the front, which is 2 scouts and the squad leader, a light machine gun unit in the middle, and a rifle team at the end, followed up by the assistant squad leader. Now, like most gamers, I've been weaned off of Hollywood action movies, war movies, westerns, and video games, so my perception of combat is completely wrong. I, like many others, am accustomed to the Hollywood style of combat whack-a-mole. Basically, 2 sets of armed people square off against each other behind cover, if you're lucky, and then they bob up and down in the same spot, exchanging fire. The good guys wait for that pregnant pause that means the enemy is reloading, and then they begin to pick them off. The other thing you'll notice is that every character in these flicks, whether they're good or bad, are basically a bunch of sociopaths. Nobody gets afraid and runs. They basically just stick it out to the bitter end, even if they're getting decimated by the one action hero. Even in many war games, we tend to square off against each other, find that sweet spot of distance where we can take the least amount of damage and inflict the most damage on the enemy and bang away at each other until one side is dead. One of the things that makes the Band of Brothers game series different is that it's based on actual combat tactics, and the design of the game forces you to use things like proximity, cover, and suppression to achieve your objective. Another key aspect is a big focus on the psychological aspect of warfare. Morale plays a big part in this game, and there are times when your soldiers will not obey your orders because they're scared or overwhelmed. So let's take a look at the squad's basic strategy, which is to dislodge an enemy group from an objective point. The first stage of the strategy is called the firefight. Typically, the squad is proceeding towards the objective in a column formation, kind of like a big, long centipede. The 2 scouts in the front act as antennae to look out for any opposition on the way to the objective. Once the objective is spotted, the automatic rifle team and the squad leader will proceed carefully to a position to cover the objective. Once in position, the automatic rifle team will begin firing on the objective to suppress any enemy troops there. Now we can see why the automatic rifle team is so critical to the squad's success. The light machine gun, whether it be a Browning automatic rifle or BAR or an M34 or whatever nationality's chosen light machine gun, is there to lay down a high rate of fire. The team has a built-in redundancy of an assistant that would take the place of the lead if he falls in combat, as well as a third man just to carry ammunition, so you can ensure that the fire that's coming from the AR team is consistent and they're well supplied. This group is going to provide the bulk of the cover fire until the remainder of the squad gets in position for the assault. Next, Phase 2 begins, which is called the advance. Once the enemy is sufficiently suppressed, the rest of the squad will begin working their way through cover towards the objective. Using cover, once the first squad members work their way closer, the following squad members will take their place in the cover they've vacated. Finally, the remainder of the team will work their way forward until everyone's in position behind cover. Then stage 3 begins, which is called the assault. The squad opens up with all arms and carpets the objective area with fire. They're not so focused on hitting a specific target as they are making sure the entire area is suppressed and covered with fire. The tactics may vary slightly here as the squad advances on the objective opening fire. Depending where the automatic rifle team is, they may switch off their fire to allow the rest of the squad to take the objective, or they may proceed with the squad and lay down. During the assault, a number of things can happen to the enemy. Their morale might be broken by all the gunfire and they may just turn tail and rout. If they don't rout, then it will probably be necessary for the assault to end in close combat. You're probably wondering, well, hell, if they're pouring so much lead on that position, wouldn't they just all be dead too? Not necessarily. Often in World War II basic training, an instructor would show the class how safe a well-dug foxhole was by placing a balloon in it. The class would open fire on the foxhole position and would be surprised when the balloon wouldn't pop. A well-dug foxhole is excellent cover. If the enemy is well dug in, it can be very difficult to hit them. And if you can't mentally break them down with all that firepower, then you're going to need to get in close and finish them off, and that can be dangerous in itself, and Jim has captured that in this game. Okay, let's look at the game objective for our chosen scenario. I'm going to show you how to set up the first scenario for Ghost Panzer, which is called Take a Building. Then I'm going to show you a small condensed version of the same firefight and run you through the rules. Take a Building is not based off of a specific battle in World War II. Instead, it's a training module for learning infantry training. But this is the background. The Russian village hall has been taken by the Germans, and it's up to the Russians to liberate the hall. Both sides have 4 turns to accomplish their mission. For this scenario, each side is going to secretly set up their units. First, the Germans will set up their units, and then they will cover them with conceal markers. This will allow the German player to keep the identities and abilities of their units secret from the German player. Next, it will be the Russians' turn to secretly place their units. They will also cover their units with conceal markers. So when the game begins, neither side knows which units are where. As they move and conduct combat, the conceal markers will be removed and the true nature of the units will be revealed. The player that holds the Russian village hall at the end of the 4th turn wins the game. Alright people, get your bits together. It's time to set up the game. In step 1, you're going to place game board number 20. In step 2, you're going to distribute the scenario squad units on each side. Step 3, organize scenario markers in the play area for each side. In the next step, you're going to identify the route edges for each side. To the north is the German route edge, and to the south is the Russian route edge. Now I've also highlighted the map to show you how the sides are divided. They're divided by that orange road that runs through the center. To the north in gray is the German side. To the south in red is the Russian side. Now each side is going to secretly set up their units. The first player to set up is the German. First, the German player needs to set up one non-decoy unit in coordinates B3 or C3 or D2. I've highlighted these hexes on the map so you can see them. I'm going to place a squad in the middle building at C3. Next, the German player may place the remainder of his units, and he can place them anywhere in the gray zone, but you need to remember that the objective is to hold the Russian town hall. So I'm going to place a large number of my units in and around the Russian town hall. The German player also has 2 decoy units to place, which act as bluffs for the Russian player to confuse them. Finally, the German player needs to place conceal markers over all of his units. This is especially important for those decoys we just placed. Now it's the Russian player's turn to secretly set up their units. The scenario requires the Russian player to place 4 units in column B or C on their side. Now, since I'm playing both sides, I will place my 4 Russian units in those columns, but as close to the Russian town hall as possible. Next, the Russian player can place the remainder of their units anywhere in the highlighted red zone. Once again, I'm going to cluster my units around the Russian town hall, since that's the objective of the game. And finally, I will place conceal units across all the Russian units. Okay, now that Take a Building is set up, we're going to change focus and look at a condensed version of the scenario. This is a fully illustrated version of the extended gameplay example at the end of the rulebook. It's basically a boiled down version of Take a Building used for teaching purposes. The significant features to keep in mind before you play the full-blown game is that there are a lot less units here. The order range is 2 orders per side, and there are stronger, more seasoned Russian soldiers to command. First, let's cover off on some basic game concepts for Band of Brothers. When each side takes its turn, it has a limit on the number of orders that it can give its troops. This is called the operations range. Each side's operations range is split into 2 pieces. The first is the flexibility and leadership. This is the minimum number of units that must be ordered per turn. The second number is the command and control stat. This is the maximum number of orders that can be given during a player's turn. Now this is the operations range from the scenario Take a Building. So you can see that the Russians have a 3-4 and the Germans have a 1-4. So what does that mean? Each side gets the same maximum number of orders, but the flexibility and leadership is very different. The Russians must order a minimum of 3 units to complete their turn, whereas the Germans only need to order 1 unit. Now every time you place an order on a unit, it uses that unit, so you can't reorder them again until the next phase. So you can see the Germans are very nimble when taking orders from their commander, whereas the Russians are not quite as flexible, especially when you consider that the Russians can chew through a lot of units quickly by just placing orders to meet their turn requirements. The operation ranges for these groups can be different from scenario to scenario, so while the Germans may have the upper hand here, in another scenario they may be more equally balanced. Now for the gameplay example we'll be looking at, the orders are a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 2 for both sides. With that said, these are the types of orders you can give your units. You can order them to move, at which point they will then be used. You can order them to move and then conduct assault fire. You can order them to fire, or you can set them up for op fire, which would have happened during your opponent's turn. Now, as your units become suppressed, it will become necessary to take a morale check before the unit can complete the order. If your unit does not have suppression, then you can skip the morale check and just complete the order. This schematic shows the definitions for a German unit marker. The status of a unit's morale is governed by ROUT progression. This is the amount of suppression a unit has sustained before the possibility of a ROUT. When the unit is a full 10, or the white number, you do not need to check morale. They will follow your orders. But as the unit becomes suppressed, it becomes more and more difficult for them to obey your orders. With light suppression, which is the yellow marker, a player who gives an order must conduct a morale check and roll a number of 6 or less for the unit to follow the order. Once the unit is fully suppressed, which is the red marker, the player needs to roll a 1 for the unit to follow the order. The casualty rating numbers, which we'll cover off a little bit more in combat, basically show you the amount of casualty that a unit can take before it's reduced to its flipped over side or is completely eliminated. Next to these numbers is the range. On this unit, it's a 6. This is the number of hexes a unit can shoot into, and they have a maximum of double for long-range shooting. Okay, next to this are the firepower ratings, and they're divided into 2 pieces. There's full regular firepower, and then there's proficient firepower. The difference is that with normal firepower, you're usually stationary and it's planned. So you can conduct normal fire or you can set up your unit for a planned op fire. Proficient firepower rating is for things that require more skills, such as moving and then conducting an assault fire, or randomly selecting a unit to conduct opportunity fire. The standard anti-tank weapon stat will be covered off in a future video regarding vehicles. Movement is very simple. If you're a squad, you have 5 movement points to use. If you're a weapons team, you're more burdened with equipment, so you only have 4 points to use. Moving from one hex to another costs you movement points. So an open ground hex only costs you 1. The wood, stone building, or wood building costs you 2. If you move up in terrain, it costs you 1 movement point plus whatever that terrain is. Roads are easily thought of buy 2, get 1 free. So for 2 movement points, you can move 3 road hexes. Okay, let's take a look at some basic combat. This is combat between a defender, which is a Russian unit, and the attacker, which is a German unit. So we're going to try to make this as simple as possible. So the attacker has normal firepower, which is a 6. So on a 10-sided dice, the attacker needs to roll at least a 6 or less to score the first level of suppression. The next 2 ranges of damage is determined by the defender's casualty rating. So when rolling a 10-sided dice, if you're able to add the first casualty number, which on this defender is a 4, to your dice result and stay within your range of modified firepower, the attacker will score 2 levels of suppression plus reduction. If the attacker can add the second number to his results and stay within the modified firepower range, then they eliminate the unit. Now in this scenario, there's not enough factors at play to make that happen. You'd need to roll a -1, which at this point is impossible. Okay, next I'm going to add in another layer of complexity with range and firepower. So here we have the same units at play, except for the Russian player has a unit at normal range and a unit at long range, so you can see the difference in the dice rolls that you need to make. The normal range mechanics are ones we just saw, but when you switch to long range, your firepower is going to get cut in half, so everything slides down. At this range, reduction plus double suppression as well as elimination are not even available anymore. The best you can hope for is a roll of 3 or less and get first level suppression. And this is normal stationary fire. If you're moving and firing, or you're kind of knee-jerk op firing, you use the second number, which is proficient firepower. And in that case, it's a 5. Then at long range, cut in half is a 2.5, which rounds up to 3. And these are well-trained German troops. If you're using some of the greener Russian troops that are in some of the early scenarios, their proficient firepower is like a 1, so it's very difficult to hit anything at long range. Okay, make sure you're familiar with the basic concepts of firepower and range, because now we're going to the deep end of the pool and doing a full battle equation. What we've just talked about is basically the first line of the battle equation, so the attacker firepower. So in this example, we're back to a 6. And we're going to have a normal range shot for this illustration. The next part of the battle equation is the target terrain modifier, and this is basically the type of terrain your target is in. So for example, if your target is in a stone building, behind a hedgerow, in a half track, a foxhole, or a trench, you modify this roll with a -2. If they're at higher elevation, there's a wood building, or they're in the woods themselves, it's a -1. And if they're at lower elevation than you get a +1 modifier. Next is the target fire modifier, and this is going to tell you whether the target is concealed, which gives you a -1, or you're adjacent to the target, which gives you a +3. Finally, if you're in op fire mode and the target is in open ground, then you get a modifier here. If you're in final op fire, you get a -2. If the range is 5 to 8 hexes and the unit's in open ground, it's a +2. And if the range is 4 hexes or less, it's +4. And this is how combat works in Band of Brothers. Opportunity fire can be confusing because there's so many different kinds in this game. There's planned opportunity fire, there's random opportunity fire, and then there's final opportunity fire. With planned opportunity fire, you spend an order to set up a unit for a future action, and they get the benefit of full firepower. Random op fire can be declared at any time during the enemy's turn, but you need to take a proficient firepower deduction. The only time you get full firepower is if your enemy is adjacent to you. And last but not least is the ill-named final opportunity fire, which really can be done at any time that there is an enemy adjacent to you, even if your unit is used. There is a -2 penalty to final op fire on the dice roll. However, if you spend a command point, you can increase final op fire to normal range. So let's talk about command points. What do they do? So command points allow you to reverse or change certain conditions in the game. If you spend 1 command point, you can re-roll a morale check, order 1 unit at the start of an opponent's turn, re-roll a melee combat roll, extend final op fire to normal range, or increase your proficient firepower +1 as long as it doesn't exceed normal firepower. Okay, now that we've covered all the basics, let's move on to our main game example. There are 4 phases in each of the game's turns. The first is the operations phase, followed by the rout phase, the melee phase, and the recovery phase. In this particular game, the Russians have the initiative and start first. We will begin with the operation phase, which is when orders are given and actions are taken until all units are used. Alright, for Russia, order number 1, squad F7 will take a shot at the German squad in coordinates G5. This is a long-range shot, which will reduce the attacker firepower from 6 to 3. The target is concealed in a wood building, so there's a -1 modifier for the wood building and a -1 modifier for the concealment, which ends our modified firepower at 1. The Russian player rolls the dice and fortunately scores a 1, which is suppression. The German player removes their concealment and reveals that they have in fact hit a decoy. The decoy is also removed and the order is complete. Russia order number 2, the squad in H6 decides to move to H5 on the way to their route to G5, but before that can happen, the German player declares op fire at squad at H5. This shot uses proficient firepower, which is a +5. Here in the open, so there's no terrain to consider. There's not a target modifier. There is an open ground op fire of +4 for a total modified firepower of 9. The German rolls the dice and gets a 3, which in our scale for this unit is a 2 levels of suppression plus reduction. The Russian player wants to keep moving, especially since his unit is out in the open. but his unit is heavily suppressed and has taken casualties, and the morale has dropped all the way to 1. He needs to make a morale check. He rolls a 5, fails the morale check, and his soldier refuses to move any further and stops in H5. And that ends order number 2. Now that the Russians have fulfilled the maximum 2 orders, it's time to switch to the Germans. For German order number 1, they're going to mark squad E6 as OP fire. And that ends their turn because their other unit is already used. Russian order number 1, the squad in G7 fires on the German squad in F5. This is a normal range shot, so we look at our battle equation. The attacker firepower is a 6. The target is in a stone building, which is a -2. There is not a target fire modifier or an open ground op fire, so the modified firepower is 4. The Russian rolls the dice and gets a 1, which is the first level of suppression. The Russian player marks his unit as used, and this ends order number 1. For Russia order number 2, the squad in H6 moves to H5, but before they can move any further, the German orders his squad member in F5 to conduct final op fire. A final op fire roll can only be used by a unit that has been used and if the enemy is adjacent. Now the squad in H5 is not adjacent, but the German player is going to use one of his command points to augment the score and change final op fire to a regular op fire. The German squad in F5 is suppressed, so to complete this order they must pass a morale check. They need a 6 or less to pass, but they roll a 7 and fail the morale check, and the soldier does not comply with the order because they're suppressed, and the German also loses their command point. The Russian squad continues to move to G5 and takes residence in the wood building. The German player makes a desperate move and tries to conduct final op fire one more time. He can now attempt this because the unit is now adjacent. This time he passes the morale check with a 5, and the unit follows his order and opens fire on the Russian unit. So now we'll run through the op fire battle equation. The attacker's firepower is 6. The target's in a wood building, so that's -1. There's an adjacent unit, so the target fire modifier of +3, and they're in final op fire, which backs it up -2 for an overall modified firepower of 6. The German rolls his dice and rolls a 2 and scores double suppression and reduction on the Russian unit. The Russian player finishes his movement and decides to engage in assault fire on the German unit. Proficient firepower is used for assault fire, but since the unit is adjacent to the German unit, they get a +1, so they operate at full firepower. There's a -2 terrain modifier because the target's in a stone building, and a target fire modifier of +3 because the target is adjacent, for a total of 5. The Russian rolls a dice. They need a 5. They unfortunately end up rolling a 6, and they miss. The unit is marked as used, and the turn is over. And we move back to the Germans. Now for German order number 1, squad E6 marked as op fire cannot be selected for an action, and the other unit is used, so that ends their turn. Back to the Russian again. The Russian in squad G7 moves to G6. The German squad in F5 conducts final op fire again. Remember, even though this German squad is used, there is no limit on the amount of times they can declare final op fire as long as the enemy unit is adjacent. Since the German squad is suppressed, a morale check is necessary to complete the order. The German player rolls a 7 and fails the morale check, and the unit is not able to complete the order. Now the German player is pretty frustrated. He decides he's going to remove the conceal marker and take advantage of his planned op fire with his unit in E6. So let's go through the battle equation. So this German unit was in a planned op fire, so he uses full firepower of 6. The target is in open terrain, so there's no modifier. There's no target fire modifier, but he is in open ground, and this is op fire, so there's a +4 modifier. The total modified firepower is 10. He rolls the dice and rolls a 9 and scores suppression on the Russian unit. The German unit has used his op fire, so now he is marked as used. The Russian squad wants to keep moving, but now they need to pass a morale check because they are suppressed. They need at least a 6 to pass the morale check, and they roll a 6 and pass. And they move into melee with the unit in F5. This completes their turn, and they are marked as used. At this point in the game, all units are now marked as used, so we end this phase. Next is the rout phase, where we will check to see if any units that are suppressed crack under pressure and make a run for it. In this phase, a rout is triggered by the proximity of a threat. There are 3 triggers. The first trigger is if an enemy unit has line of sight and is within 5 hexes. The second trigger is if an enemy unit is adjacent. And the third trigger is if an enemy unit occupies the same hex. Any of these situations will trigger a rout and require a morale check. When a rout is triggered, the unit needs to make a rout check, which is basically a morale check to see if they can hold it together. In the first example, the unit needs a 6 or less to keep from routing, and they failed that check, so they will rout. However, if the unit fails to check so badly that you can add in the second casualty number, then the unit is also reduced or eliminated. If a unit is already reduced when it makes a rout check, it gets the full second statistic for casualty. So it gets the full 7 points to try to prevent routing. So once the unit is routed and they're in flight, they need to trace a path to their rout edge. But it's important to remember they cannot come within 1 adjacent hex of an enemy unit or they will be eliminated. The unit will use its movement points, in this case 5 movement points, to work his way towards the rout edge and then off the board and out of the game. If a unit fails their rout check while they're in melee and moves to an adjacent square, they are immediately eliminated, unless there's a second enemy unit in the hex that would prevent the other unit from attacking the router. And if both units in melee fail their rout check, then they're both eliminated. Okay, in our example game, there are only 2 units that need to go through this rout process. The 2 units occupying F5. Both of these units are in the same hex. They both feel threatened by each other. Let's see if either one of them cracks and runs. First, the Russian player needs to pass their rout check. They need a 6 or less to pass. The Russian player rolls a 7 and fails the rout check. However, before they rout, the Russian player decides to use a command point to be able to re-roll the check. They roll it again, they roll a 5, and they pass the check. Now the German squad must pass their morale check. They need to roll a 6 or less. The German player rolls a 9 and fails the morale check. So then the unit routs. And once the unit routs, it moves adjacent to the enemy squad, not in melee, which is in G5, and the unit is eliminated. So things did not end well for the German unit. Next is the melee phase, which is really like the second part of the rout phase. We do not have any melee to resolve, but I will show you how it works. In the melee phase, each side that occupies a hex rolls 2 10-sided dice to see if they can score a hit on the other unit. This gives each side 2 chances to hit, and they're basically rolling against their unmodified firepower. So the German player would need to roll a 6 to score a hit, and the Russian player would need to roll a 4 in this example to score a hit. The last phase is the recovery phase, which is basically a cleanup and cool down phase. For Russia's recovery, they're going to remove all their use markers, and then they're going to remove the suppressed marker from squad F5. Squad G5 and H5 are essentially going to cool down from fully suppressed to just suppressed. For the Germans' last remaining squad in E6, they're going to remove their OPFire and their use marker. And we're ready to move to the next round of play. And now that we've completed this full turn, you should have enough knowledge to go back and play Take a Building. One last rule to cover off on is the use of weapons teams. The primary benefit of weapons teams is that they have much greater range than regular units, but they suffer from a weaker melee rating. Mortars in particular have additional abilities and penalties, such as they cannot fire in buildings. But if they fire on foxholes and woods, the cover there does not protect the enemy units. Finally, if a mortar does not have a line of sight, they can coordinate with a unit that does, but only at a -1 penalty. Also, with the greater range comes a greater responsibility to make sure that they actually have a good line of sight. So you want to make sure you check that as well. Hopefully this tutorial has given you a good idea how to play Band of Brothers games and given you some insight into the design of Jim Krohn's system. And with that, I'm Ben Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.